think we're all here. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Ann Cockrel, and I'm Director of Programs for Image. We're a nonprofit dedicated to fostering contemporary art that grapples with the mystery of faith. And it's just a real delight to be here today and to be to play a role in convening just one of the many fascinating conversations that are taking place here at the Douglas Coupland Conference. Our panel is about God after God, Douglas Coupland, Marshall McLuhan, and divine absence in the digital age. Before I introduce our panelists, I do want to just take a minute to thank the conference organizers, Diletta, Mary, and Andy, who you all know apparently and have just met, for dreaming up this gathering and also making it a reality. Those are two distinct projects, so thank you for doing both pieces of them. A few years ago, Mary wrote a really lovely essay about Coupland's work for Image's literary journal. And so I just want to encourage you to check that out if you haven't already. I think the link will be in the chat box here shortly. One quick, I just want to make sure Nick was there. The topic for today's panel was largely the brainchild of Image's culture editor, Nick Ripatrazone, who joins us here today, and has been thinking about Coupland a lot in the context of his own forthcoming book on another Canadian cultural and intellectual icon, Marshall McLuhan. Hopefully everyone here has had a chance to watch the short remarks each of our panelists provided in advance, as we'll largely be using those talks as jumping off points. But I trust you'll be able to follow along. If not, and just for context, I want to just read out our panel description for today's conversation. Quote, 21st century life is karaoke, a never-ending attempt to maintain dignity while a jumble of data uncontrollably blips across the screen, end quote. Douglas Coupland wrote these words in 2010 in his masterful biography of Marshall McLuhan, a mid-20th century literature turned unlikely electronic prophet. Peppered with footnotes, asides, and questions for the reader, Coupland's biography of his fellow Canadian is not only a window into understanding McLuhan's eccentricities and brilliance, but also a mirror of Coupland himself. A quarter of the way through his book, Coupland wonders in a footnote why biographies might still matter in the age of Wikipedia, when we can find so much of this information, as he does himself, online. Coupland posits that perhaps biographies help us as readers and writers, quote, to try to enter an already vanishing mode of perceiving the past. The notion that a landscape is best viewed with a single source of light, the sun, one light bulb, a lone candle, a lone writer, so that all the shadows and highlights are true to each other, end quote. Coupland's work enables us to both capture the extreme present of our digital world and, following in the tradition of McLuhan, consider its effects. Yet Coupland consistently does so from an anatheist perspective, what the Irish philosopher Richard Kearney calls a renewed quest for God after God. Coupland's spiritually rich biography, a thoroughly God-haunted theorist, whom Wired magazine calls their patron saint, and his own fiction, including Life of God, reveal a wrestling with a divine absence in the digital age. Coupland compels us to wonder, what is God after God in the digital world? How might we consider the vanishing modes of perceiving the past in order to better understand our extreme present? Really delighted to be exploring these questions today with three distinguished writers who I'm excited to talk with and to hear talk amongst themselves. First up, Diletta de Cristofaro, who in addition to being one of the organizers of this conference is a research fellow at Northumbria University in the UK. She writes about contemporary culture, crises, and the politics of time. Her essay appeared in journals like Critique, Studies in Contemporary Fiction, Boundary 2 Online, and Open Library of Humanities, and in edited collections published by Palgrave and Cambridge University Press. She's also the author of the contemporary post-apocalyptic novel, Critical Temporalities and the End Times. Meghan O'Giblin is also with us. She writes essays and features for Harper's, The New Yorker, The Guardian, The New York Times, and elsewhere. And she's currently a columnist for Wired magazine. Her work has received 3 Pushcart Prizes and appeared in the Best American Essays anthology, She is also the author of the essay collection Interior States, which won the Believer Book Award for nonfiction. And her forthcoming book is God, Human, Animal, Machine, and that will be published, I think, this August. So keep your eyes open for that. And then already referenced Nick Ripatrazone, who is the culture editor for Image. Grateful to be a colleague of his. He's also contributing to Millions and a columnist for Literary Hub. He's a very busy guy. He has written about poetry, religion, books, and culture for Rolling Stone, GQ, The Atlantic, The Pew, Commonweal, and Esquire. He's also the author of 2 books, Longing for an Absent God, In Doubt, Great American Fiction, and Wild Belief, Poets and Prophets Wilderness, and just announced this week officially his forthcoming book on Marshall McLuhan. It's called Digital Communion, Marshall McLuhan's Spiritual Vision for a Virtual Age, and that'll be coming out here in 2022. So my goal here is to get these brilliant people talking to each other. The less I talk, the better. And also the more we hear from you guys as our audience, the better. So please do feel free to send those questions in via chat, and we'll get to them, to as many of them as we can as we have time. So I'll finally, after all the throat clearing, we'll get to our first question for all of you. And I think a conference celebrating the 30th anniversary, obviously, of Coupland's novel Generation X, a sort of text, I think, for so much of our pop culture. And it feels appropriate to start with a bit of a context for how each of you first discovered Coupland's work. He's a novelist, but also prolific in so many creative mediums, so I won't even assume it was through a book. So I'd love to hear each of you, what was your first introduction, and what did you find in his work that kept you so engaged? And Diletta, let's start with you.
Sure. Yes. So I did actually encounter Coupland as a novelist, first of all. And I was working on my PhD project, which was on the contemporary post-apocalyptic novel. And my supervisor recommended Girlfriend in a Coma to me. So that was my first encounter. And I have to admit, and apologies to everybody in this meeting who is a lover of Girlfriend in a Coma, that actually that novel didn't really do it for me that much. There was something about the end. Sorry, but clearly something else must have actually convinced me about Coupland, given that I'm one of the organizers of the conference. Yeah, there was something about the ending that didn't really convince me. In some ways, this kind of first encounter was then corrected when I went back predictably to Generation X, which on the other hand was love at first sight. And what I find particularly fascinating about that book, and in general about Coupland's works as a whole, is that even when you read his fictions, you're not just reading a kind of fictional account. What you're reading is also a kind of theory of the present, a kind of philosophical approach to the present, or the extreme present, if we want to use this idea that obviously has been at the course conference. So it's really this kind of theoretical approach to the present that I find fascinating, and how basically, as I was saying a little bit in my kind of pre-recorded remarks, by reading him, we find ways to make sense of the present, and potentially, going back to that idea of denarration that I was talking about, maybe re-narrate ourselves and reorient ourselves within the extreme present.
Yeah, that sounds great. Nick or Meghan, what about you guys?
I could hop in. Yeah, I also came to Coupland for the first time through his fiction. So my entry point was Life After God, which I first read, I think, in the early 2000s. And I didn't know anything about Coupland at the time. I came across the book at a used bookstore in Detroit, and was attracted to the title because I had just stopped believing in God myself about a year before, and dropped out of a theology program. So, I bought the book, on one hand knowing that it was fiction, but also kind of hoping that it was like a handbook or self-help or something, which in a way it kind of was, I guess. I really identified obviously with the of, so the dilemma of his characters in that book, which is this, this question of how to find meaning in a world that's been, newly disenchanted. and whether there is some sort of secular form of transcendence or grace. And that was a question that I think a lot of contemporary novelists during that time weren't really exploring, or at least the ones that I had read. And it wasn't really a question that I think people my age, millennials who were, in our early 20s at the time, weren't really interested in discussing. So, I guess what drew me into his work was just this will to think about those big questions, like what does it mean to be human? What are the failures of secularism, and questions that I think that we as a post-religious still haven't really answered. And I think that's one reason why I keep, returning to his work, and one reason why it feels so relevant still today.
Yeah. Nick, what about you?
I first discovered him when I picked up a copy of Generation X in a used bookstore when I was a freshman in college. And previously I had not heard much about his work. I was first kind of interested in the intertextuality, sort of the images and the text. And for someone who was quite young reading it, it was something that really piqued my interest. But what was fascinating to me was reading this a decade after it came out and having Generation X be a term that was used, what was sort of finding the origin of that in him, and kind of backtracking and rewinding, sort of thinking about life and fitting the puzzle together. I think for him, it's almost like he was able to simultaneously capture what we've discussed as the extreme present, even for him back then, but also be this sort of quasi-prophetic voice. And when you find someone like that who is simultaneously now and kind of open to the future, that's the kind of artist and writer that you want to hang on to. So it was someone that I stayed with, and in writing about Marshall McLuhan, have been drawn back to Coupland, because I think he is one of the best in capturing that media theorist and his importance. And it's great to be able to talk about him.
That's fantastic. And Annie in the chat just mentioned that she's loving these references to used bookstores. And I can add in my own, because that's where I also, Life After God, found a copy of that in college as well. And maybe there's something specifically about college, particularly maybe in the States, maybe everywhere in the world, where you have the energy and kind of curiosity to spend a lot of time in used bookstores. And that's what the cool kids do. So that is interesting to think about, that is a place where in college and through a used bookstore is where many of us first encountered Coupland. Nick, I want to talk about, obviously in today's panel, we're talking about Coupland's work kind of alongside Marshall McLuhan. And it's notable how deeply, as you point out, McLuhan in your talk, McLuhan's ideas were shaped by his conversion to Roman Catholicism in his early adulthood. And you mentioned that for McLuhan, media was a form of mass. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about what you mean by that.
Sure. Yeah, as you note, Marshall McLuhan became a quite ardent Catholic convert. His conversion sort of started when he was at Cambridge, and I believe around 1936, 1937, he fully converted. And as with many converts of that time, he really fell in headfirst to the church and its theology. But what was interesting about McLuhan is that he was reading the church fathers when that conversion started to happen. And simultaneously, he had this interest in the British Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins and in James Joyce. So when you put Joyce and Hopkins together, although they were both Catholic, Joyce, of course, was rather lapsed and maybe some people could say heretical. But I think that Joyce, even in his heresies, is a profoundly Catholic writer. And a book like Ulysses is difficult to understand, at least without the lens of Catholicism as being a foil. So McLuhan was influenced by these sort of very different Catholics. And when he started writing about media, print media specifically, in The Mechanical Bride in 1951, he would talk about something that he described as a trance. And when Mechanical Bride was published, he sort of admitted he was a little bit late to the game, I guess you can say, and should have paid attention to television. And that's where he focused on for much of the majority of his media work. And when he would describe television, he would describe it as being trance-like. And for someone like McLuhan, who would be very much into the sensory elements of Mass, that would be an emotional religious moment for him. And there's a transubstantive quality to this. And for McLuhan, I think the idea of sort of a perfect media would be a Mass writ large, kind of all over the world, and a sort of perfect ecumenical digital communion. And for McLuhan, even though he was skeptical of the potential of media, he had, I think, an ultimate optimism in the possibility of some sort of religious transcendence. So for Mass to be kind of a communal worldwide experience would be almost a perfect possibility in McLuhan's mind.
Fascinating. That's really helpful to think about. It actually, previously I haven't really put together those two words, trance and transcendence, are two. That's an interesting kind of way of understanding those words together. Diletta, I wonder, in your talk, kind of sticking with for a moment, kind of this kind of Coupland's theory, so to speak, and McLuhan's theology, your talk suggested to me a way in which Coupland's theology, if we can kind of call it that, is maybe a mirror-like invention of kind of traditional theology here, represented by the Roman Catholic Church. And I'd like to see if you agree, or if you think I'm missing something here when I say partaking of Mass is an act that is both deeply personal and also intrinsically communal, as Nick was just pointing out. You take the bread and wine into your individual body, but you do it in concert with millions of others. So the sacrament offers communion with God, but it's also like with fellow believers as well. Both of those things are involved in the traditional Catholic Mass, at least. Within the Catholic Church, salvation comes from communion with God, but is kind of bound up in relationships with people. And it seems to me that in Coupland's work, those two things are swapped. You know, salvation, such as it is, comes from communion with people, but is bound up in this quest for God or meaning. Perhaps those things are interchangeable to some extent in his work. Do you think that's an observation, or what do you think it misses or gets right about like transcendence in Coupland's work?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think it's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think that, so there was an interesting conversation yesterday at the end of the day on the spirituality panel. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting Steve Taylor's views here, but I found something very interesting about what he was saying, because it goes in the same direction of what I was trying to say in that talk, and that you were just going back to then. So he was saying that basically Coupland doesn't have a kind of fully fledged view of transcendence per se, but that he's wondering if there is a transcendence. So it's more about the kind of wondering. And so in your relation, I would really put the kind of emphasis on the idea of a quest. So a quest for meaning that in Coupland often ends up kind of bound up with the idea of God, but it's a quest that I would maintain kind of remains unresolved, open. So there are often kind of these, revelatory moments in Coupland's writings, or epiphanies, but I would say that these revelations are often partial in many ways. So there is this sense that, there is a desire for God, but whether then his characters actually do find God is an entirely different question. So, there's this sentence, for instance, in Player One, that with kind of slight variations in other novels by Coupland, and it's a sentence that goes something like, we're all born separated from God, and yet we mean something, we must. And I think that must is interesting, because it kind of beautifully captures this yearning, this desire for God, but also how this desire in some ways, that must, that kind of insistence, almost as if this desire is by definition unquenchable, right? It's something that never comes fully to fruition. But on the other hand, what characters do certainly find in his fictions, I think, is connection with other people, right? And I think going back to what Nick was just saying there about trans, something that Coupland mentioned in the interview that we recorded a few weeks ago and that we're showing tonight, he mentioned that fiction and reading a novel is like a kind of shared trans. So there's, once again, that kind of sense of communion that comes from storytelling within his fictions, but also a kind of sense of communion that is created between him, his characters, and of course us as readers. So I think that really the kind of meaning is found in these communions with other people, in these kind of sociable moments, in these relationships.
I love that that image of reading fiction as a kind of trance as well, and a kind of shared experience. It's something that I think a lot about in terms of music and live music, especially in this time when we're missing being able to go out and have live music, with that sense of like shared, it really is like a religious experience, right? When you're in a crowd and really moved by the music. And I haven't always, everything you can say wonderful about literature, I haven't quite actually imagine that in the same way, but as you say it, I think it is exactly that. We're all kind of in our own chairs, or in our own spaces at different times. It's asynchronous, perhaps trance, to use language of the moment. But I love that, pointing that out, that Coupland actually creates communion through his fiction. Yeah, really great. Meghan, I want to talk about, your talk explores kind of this inversion to some extent, this kind of elevating human connection above a connection to God, and how that kind of tracks, I thought this was also really fascinating, how that tracks with our shifting notions around narrative and authorship in the digital age. As Diletta had pointed out in her talk, faith or God used to really ground people in a story. But why would anyone these days kind of care about a single story or a single author when you can access so many stories and authors and perspectives? As you said in your talk, Meghan, we've gone from authoritative print encyclopedias that spoke with a single voice, kind of fixed in print for generations, to Wikipedia that collects millions of voices and is being revised literally every second. And I think the general consensus, at least, is that this is better. And yet you contend that this critique of authorship is also a critique of authority and ultimately the notion of God itself. So if the medium is the message, as McLuhan is famous for saying, is it possible, do you think, that digital media is an intrinsically secular form of communication? One that can be harnessed by the faithful, but that is always kind of tugging away from a grand narrative that seems to be inherent, important to the structure of most religion and kind of religious belief.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I wouldn't go so far to say that digital media is intrinsically secular, but I think because the internet in particular is decentralized and radically democratic, or it is in theory at least, as it is in its architecture. It is, as you mentioned, it's kind of designed to critique or to deconstruct these grand narratives or other forms of authority. So you see this especially, on social media, where you have these sort of powerful figures that are taken down by mobs of ordinary people, or even in the fact just that digital media has kind of obliterated the monoculture. So we're getting our news and our entertainment from all these sort of niche sources, as opposed to from some figure like, Walter Cronkite is kind of the stereotype of this, voice of God that used to sort of deliver the consensus. And I guess I'm kind of interested in how that process of fracturing or decentralization kind of mirrors trends in secularism, or sort of secularization trends, at least in the US over the past 10 years or so, which is that people are not becoming less spiritual, but they are becoming kind of more atomized in their search for spirituality or meaning. So, and you see this especially in the decline in church attendance and church membership. I think people tend to be very skeptical today of religious institutions and religious authority, and are sort of looking for religious or transcendent experiences that are more syncretic or bespoke, which is something like Tara Isabella Burton has written a lot about in her journalism and nonfiction. But, you know, I guess it's interesting too, because there's this paradox where, like, even though the internet itself is very decentralized, there are sort of these cohesive narratives or voices that arise out of these spaces, almost like an emergent feature of the system itself. So Wikipedia is one example. Like, it's, you know, authored ostensibly by thousands of anonymous users, but it appears on the outside as sort of this veneer of being, you know, speaking to us in this sort of like disembodied voice, almost like an oracle, speaking to us from the void. Or, you know, to cite a more negative example, I mentioned briefly in my talk, like QAnon, which has been compared exhaustively to a religion, and yet is similarly very decentralized, sort of this polyphonous narrative that relies on multiple anonymous storytellers and interpreters. So yeah, it's interesting to think about this in terms of like Nick and Diletta's points about transcendence and community, because I think there was this narrative, I think like the great hope for the internet that still kind of persists today is that because its structure is democratic, it's going to produce narratives that are also democratic, and it's going to, you know, give everybody a voice, create more diversity, more narratives. And it certainly has that potential. I think, you know, if you think about grassroots movements like BLM or the Arab Spring that kind of emerged from these communities online. But at the same time, I think the system is also capable of producing, you know, authoritative or authoritarian, in fact, ideologies that are totally self-organized without an institution or a leader behind them.
That's really interesting, that the idea that, so I think part of what I took from your talk was this idea that the decentralization of authorship, or kind of like the additional voices, like kind of brought into question, or, you know, kind of questions the authority of like the author, capital A, you know, that is God. But what I'm hearing you say is that actually this kind of cacophony, weirdly enough, can organize itself in such a way as to still create kind of like authoritative texts, or texts that like function in this way, that are supposed to be kind of like that, much in the way that like the God author functions. Is that what I'm hearing? Am I understanding you correctly, that you're just pointing out that like that together people can do the same thing that they once just attributed kind of to God?
Right. Yeah, that's a great encapsulation. Yeah, it's almost like we still have revelation or scripture, you know, in some sense, that is regarded as infallible, even though there's not an author, a single, you know, human author behind it. And yeah, a lot of it is being now sort of like, these narratives are being aided and abetted by bots and automated systems too, which is another form of sort of this erasure of the human, or the human author.
So maybe it's less that we have, it's actually that we have more authoritative texts. It used to be that we had like the Bible, you know, or like there was the idea of like an authoritative text, and instead of like having texts that are less authoritative, what we have is lots of texts that claim authority.
And they conflict like one another. Yeah,
one another, exactly. Yeah, and that's actually that's a really interesting point. Sticking with you, Meghan, a bit in your talk, you asked a really provocative question. This is very much related to what we're talking about. And I would love to hear Nick and Diletta also respond to this question. You asked, does our ability to make sense of the world require, as Coupland claims, a single author with conscious intent? Or is it enough to search for patterns in the disenchanted wilderness of information, hunting for echoes and signs in the channels of communication? As you point out, such questions are urgent as these patterns of digital become much more complex, especially with bots in the mix, you know, increasingly. So maybe while Nick and Diletta kind of consider that question, perhaps you can start us by explaining kind of what you think is at stake in this question, or kind of what are the ramifications of either way, the single author with conscious intent, or it being enough to search for patterns.
Yeah. I guess I deliberately framed that as a question in the talk because I don't know the answer to it. I don't know if there's an answer, but I do think the question is important, and it's one obviously that a lot of Coupland's work deals with this question, as you know, and his characters are sort of up against this question of like, can there be meaning in a world without God or without an author? Mm-hmm. And it seems like a lot of his books conclude that there can be, but it's something that we have to author ourselves, or there's no like intrinsic meaning in the world, but it's something we can project onto it or sort of create in these human communities. And so I guess the question that I'm interested in is like, what does that process of meaning making look like when it happens in a virtual space where it's very difficult to tell truth from fiction or information from disinformation? And there's just like so much, Coupland writes a lot about this idea of like information overload or information glut. Like there's so much information at our disposal now that's very easy to find support for even these very harebrained conspiracy theories, and possible to connect with people who, are like-minded. So I guess what's at stake on one hand is just this kind of like epistemological free-for-all. And then another more speculative scenario I alluded to briefly in my talk is that like, when are we going to sort of get exhausted with this create your own adventure version of truth and start longing for some sort of more authoritative voice to restore objectivity and consensus, as we have a history of doing as humans? And so, and that's where, I see that a lot in current politics, and then also just, in our relationship to AI, which is already becoming a lot more intelligent than we are in certain areas, and is also sort of this endpoint of the digital erasure of the human author.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Nick or Diletta, I'd love to hear. You don't have to have an answer, but any thoughts about the question?
No, you go, Nick.
Okay, thanks. I love the question. I mean, I think first thing that jumps out at me is kind of coming to this from, I guess, a Catholic tradition. It's the mid-century debate between Teilhard de Chardin and the idea of this, we're going towards this omega point, this kind of evolutionary conclusion, and a belief in a pattern in a single authorship. Well, contemporaries of his, like Father Nogar, Raymond Nogar, would argue that there's, his book, The Lord of the Absurd, the idea that absurdity is what we should seek if we're seeking some sort of a divine authorship, that if we look for patterns, we might find them, but it might be more telling about who we are and what we look for than the reality. I think the internet and the digital world is an absurd place. I feel like I'm in Eugene Ionesco's The Bald Soprano most times when I'm online. Sometimes that's fun, sometimes it's frightening, but I do think that there is a trouble perhaps in this single authorship as creating something in our own image. And I think I would be personally more content with sort of the Lord of the Absurd viewpoint, I guess, that the strangeness and the discord of being online, while frustrating and definitely problematic and hurtful at times for people, also is indicative of almost a transcendence beyond something that we can quantify. And if we can quantify, then maybe it's not divine sort of after all.
I mean, I think I really like Meghan's image of the author as a filter. I think it was in your talk, in your pre-recorded remarks, because I think that obviously, I mean, writers and narratives by definitions are ways through which we make sense of the world around us, right? We create patterns, and obviously I'm understanding narrative in a very kind of broad sense, not fiction necessarily, but even non-fiction arguments are narratives. So it's a kind of imposing order on chaos in many ways. And I like that idea of writers such as Coupland, for instance, with his definitions and all those kind of new concepts that he coins in order to help us understand, again, this kind of context in which we live. I like this idea of the author as a kind of filter that helps us filter through the noise and see patterns and orient ourselves. So I guess that would be my answer to Meghan's excellent question, but really tough to answer.
Well, I think sometimes the best questions really don't have an answer. So yeah, thank you, Meghan, for bringing that to us. Diletta, as you noted in your talk, speaking of narration, that's a big kind of focus of what you're talking about. And denarration, you say, is the process whereby one's life stops feeling like a story. And Coupland, I guess, first presented it in Polaroids from the Dead, but he also explores it, I think, in so much of his work, really, including Player One, which you kind of focus on in your talk. And denarration seems to be a response to perhaps an outcome or result of living in a more secular society. And correct me if I'm wrong with that assertion. And yet Coupland's characters seem to long for re-narration. Maybe that's another way of like, yeah, I'm curious what you think accounts for this narrative drive, just that desire for narration, for your life to feel like a story. And what do you think are some of the sources for re-narration in Coupland's work?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a kind of long line of thinkers that see narratives again as sense-making patterns, right? So, so for instance, I'm very interested in my own work in the idea of time and how we make sense of it. And so, from Paul Ricoeur onwards, there is this idea that narratives are specifically ways of making sense of time. So, Ricoeur famously says that time becomes human, so something that can make sense to us as human beings only when it is organized by narratives. And then somebody like Kermode, for instance, kind of develops this idea by thinking about narratives as the ways through which we move from chronos, which is this kind of like succession of moments without really any kind of clear meanings, and then we move through narratives from chronos to kairos, so a kind of timeline infused with meaning. And I think that Coupland kind of works in the same vein, in the sense that to him, the idea of denarration is really related to this sense of an extreme present, so a time that doesn't feel like time anymore, that it is accelerating, a kind of moment in which, the future has kind of collapsed into the present, because, the future as this kind of, how we used to think about it, as this, open horizon of possibility, potentially isn't even there anymore because of things like the climate crisis, for instance. So I think that denarration is really playing into all these kind of ideas around narrative as potentially sense-making when it comes to time. And so again, in terms of sources of re-narration in Coupland's work, I think that the biggest one is really storytelling, and communal storytelling specifically. So I think that it's really interesting that often, Coupland's fictions are not really about a single protagonist, but they're more about a kind of group of people coming together and telling stories to each other. So in these kind of encounters, these people come together, they tell stories, they reflect upon each other's stories. And so in these kind of moments, they attempt together to, make patterns, to patch together some possible narratives for the present moment. So definitely storytelling. Also nature, I think, is an interesting source of re-narration and in Coupland fiction. And I think that, so there are several moments in which Coupland's characters have encounters with natural environments that feel that kind of regenerate them, right? So it's, for instance, the ending of Generation X is a good example to think about. And I think that the reason why that happens is because nature kind of allows these characters to transcend potentially the kind of, again, extreme present, the kind of situation in which they live, and kind of anchor themselves onto something that goes beyond the individual, and something that goes, beyond the kind of frustrations of the world in which we live. So I would definitely say that the main kind of sources of re-narration are storytelling itself and encounters with nature.
You know, I hadn't really thought about it till just now, the way you framed that, the narration as like also something that's happening in relationship to time, you know, in our experience of time. And it just strikes me that the increasing population of meditation as well, I see in that, and this is a little astray from Coupland's work per se, because I don't see a lot of it there, but there's an interesting way in which, even though it's a kind of a singular activity, there's a way in which I think part of what people do who get deeply into the practice of meditation, it's a way of kind of harnessing time in a different way and kind of trying to reject the kind of everything happening so fast and all the time, just kind of stepping outside of that.
I mean, there's actually a kind of recurrent fantasy in Coupland's fictions about time stopping. So actually, like, although it's not framed as meditation, right, characters constantly yearn for moments in which time can finally stop. But like not as in dying, but as in, you know, having a pause from the kind of constant, you know, flow of information, for instance, or constant acceleration. So I think you're absolutely right.
That's interesting. I know in my own fantasy life, one of my most recurrent fantasies is the ability to just stop time for a minute so I can catch up. So, yeah, relate. Nick, you quote a passage from Coupland's biography of McLuhan in your talk, and I'm going to kind of butcher it a bit because I didn't quite transcribe it perfectly. So please correct me if I misspeak here in any way that's meaningful. You say, or Coupland writes, kind of about McLuhan, quote, "My sense of the current world is that most people assume that other people are inundated and with data, where I note that people seem to be enjoying it. It's not all marketing, persecution, and horror stories. We must remember that the world is cyclical." And here I'm kind of jumping over some things. He says, Coupland says, "We will return to where we were. But all of us crave drama and feel the need to feel needed. But we must find solace, as Marshall McLuhan did, in natural law." And this is the line that I think is really striking. Coupland writes, "Goodness will always be larger than badness by just one increment." And I see that, it's fascinating to me that like such a fundamentally optimistic, he's so like fundamentally optimistic and humane, like there's a real humanism at work, I think, in Coupland's thinking, that feels like his own grand narrative to some extent. His maybe big picture is that goodness will always be better than badness, larger than badness by one increment. Anyway, I just thought that was really interesting, and kind of to invoke natural law itself feels almost kind of nostalgic or retro. And I just wonder how you understand that optimism, or how do you see optimism in Coupland's work fundamentally in the way that seems to be true in that statement? Yeah,
I was definitely struck with that moment when I got to it in his biography of McLuhan, and I believe it's very much towards the end, where he's coming to this sort of summative moment. It's not only optimistic, but it's sentimental in the best sort of way. And I think Coupland feels an affinity for McLuhan as a fellow Canadian. He kind of ends the book talking about their similarities, but they diverge, of course, on one sort of important element of their life, and that is McLuhan's faith, and Coupland's sort of here much more of a seeker than him. When I think of the part that you just read, I think it's the first story in Life After God. The character is talking about what about us is specifically human. I think it was like a funny mix of like smoking, bodybuilding, and writing, or something like that, and it was like classic kind of Coupland humor. But the idea was that it's sometimes hard to pinpoint what that is, and for someone like McLuhan, based on his beliefs, we would be both sort of special in sort of an incarnational sense, but also there would be this sort of natural law that underpins everything, and that's the reason for Coupland's reference in this moment. Coupland is a great biographer because I think he can inhabit in a way that others can't, and there are parts of his biography that are creative, There are moments where he writes almost as McLuhan. And I think that, I mean, Coupland does say that, once again, rather sentimentally, that the world was better to have McLuhan in it, that his place in this world mattered. And so he believed that a visionary who was so influential was governed by a philosophy that perhaps Coupland at some points in his life did not agree with or thought was outdated, yet Coupland was willing to consider it. So I think Coupland, as a thinker and as an artist and as a writer, has an omnivorous kind of tendency. And there's something to be learned for that in a world where we are polarized for many reasons, but also seeking to distance ourselves from others, perhaps in a combative way. There's something kind of profoundly optimistic about his project overall.
Mm-hmm. And what do you, there's a couple of folks, Tony and Matthew, and some folks in the chat are asking, what do you think is the foundation for Coupland's optimism? Do you think there's a foundation there for that kind of optimism, or do you think that's not even necessary to it?
I guess conjecturing it would be there, and I think Meghan has discussed this in her talk, as well as in her excellent other writing about sort of a God after God concept, post-secular. It seems like Coupland at some point has, like a lot of people who grew up without sort of a religious schema, had a desire to understand things in a way to quantify them. And that sort of dichotomy that I mentioned before about the pattern versus the absurdity, they're both systems. And I think Coupland recognizes that the quote that you read about the constant information that we encounter, inevitably, as Meghan has also mentioned, the move from the print finality of capital T truth to this sort of malleability of it. For Coupland, even in that, what McLuhan would talk about as the maelstrom, like sort of pose idea of the person trying to not drown, there's a need to find something, because without it, there's a little bit of a just drifting sort of through space. And I feel like Coupland has put his finger on something quite powerful there.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I want to, we're going to, I've got just a few more questions, and be mindful of the time. I know, Mary, you had a question that I wanted to give you a chance to maybe unmute yourself and ask to the group, if you are still interested. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Lisa. Well, I was thinking of something Meghan said, but I would love for Meghan to respond, but then if others want to chime in, when you were talking about, your experience of buying Life After God, because this is when you had stopped believing in God yourself. And then it sounded as if, and I might be wrong, it sounded as if you came to the conclusion that Life After God, Coupland was saying that we can create meaning without God. But I read that completely the opposite. So I wanted to ask your thoughts, because at the end of Life After God, Scout overtly says he cannot love, he cannot forgive, and he cannot be kind without God. So that, to me, and the stories are all about broken relationships because of an inability to love, forgive, or be kind. And it seems like the secret that's within the narrator at the end is this desire for God. So I read Life After God not so much about the absence of God, but the absence of belief in God. So I'm wondering what your thoughts about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I love about that book so much is that it could be read in many different ways. He's not sort of giving a message at the end. It's really sort of dealing with the complexity of that sort of post-religious experience. I think one moment I really love from that book, I think it's in the very last story in Life After God, where he talks about how one of the characters is talking about how a group of blind people asked him to take a photo of them. And he said, they're blind, but they still believe in photos. They still believe in sight. And it's sort of supposed to be, I took that as sort of this metaphor of the idea that, there's still some sort of value to religious belief, or maybe in hoping for some sort of replacement for that, even if we have become, as a secular culture, unable to see that dimension ourselves. And yeah, I mean, there's sort of these moments, there's these little moments of grace or transcendence that sort of pop into those stories at different moments. I definitely think that Coupland is probably not on board with any sort of like grand unifying narrative. There's another part in that book where he talks about how we think our lives are one thing. We think that the story of our lives is sort of the standard trajectory of milestones, but it's actually maybe our life story actually happens in these sort of small moments, sort of unexpected interactions with others. So I do think there's something sort of redemptive, or at least he leaves open maybe the possibility of some sort of meaning in life without God.
Thank you, Megan.
Another question from the audience I think is interesting, specifically related to the project, Coupland's project on McLuhan here, from Alistair. He says he's been thinking a lot about the future, about future biographers a lot. There won't be libraries housing a person's papers, diaries, journals, letters, etc., because all our communications are done electronically now. They've taken up penmanship and calligraphy as resistance to this, as a kind of private protest. But how will future biographers gather the material? And what will there be a need for biographers in the post-Wikipedia world? And I'd be curious, Nick, obviously you've been dealing in it with this specific work on McLuhan and Coupland, but I'd be curious also, Meghan and Diletta, if you have ideas about biography and any kind of nexus of things Alistair is pointing out here.
Well, I think it's a good reminder that when we write about people's lives and we write about their letters, in the literary world, there's such an expectation that one would mine the letters of famous writers. And I have to kind of admit some guilt at some point, reminding myself, like, these are private correspondence. And when we think of our emails and messages and texts as being fodder for these potential things, and all the sort of all the privacy issues that come up, there's a tradition in literature of not caring about privacy, I guess you could say, when someone reaches a certain level of esteem. And even with McLuhan, Coupland, of course, had access to rather voluminous letters, and some that were published previously and some that were not. And I feel like because in that world before the internet, there was some sort of a border, and there was a world that existed perhaps in private, and there was a world that existed in public, and that public world was for many people rather narrow, and right now it's not. And even if one has a few followers or many, most of us can be found online, and without that sort of wall between the public and the private lives, I think biographers right now have a rather complicated job ahead of them. And I'd be interested if people know in the chat or elsewhere, or fellow panelists. I'm trying to think of biographies of writers of the relatively digital age, and I don't know if we've been here in that world long enough to warrant them, but I'm trying to think of ones that look that way. I feel like we're still in the age of letters and correspondence, but I don't know if people know about biographies that are mining the virtual world, but it could be interesting to talk about what that looks like.
I mean, not a biography or biographies as such, but I was struck by the fact that when I was a fellow at the Harry Ransom Center a few years ago, looking at the Jim Crace papers, and actually there was a lot of digital material, so emails and various kind of drafts of novels preserved. So I guess that in some ways the kind of archiving of material is changing, in the sense that obviously it's also taking into account the digital, but the idea of the archive is still very much there. Then again, I mean, it's a different question. I guess it becomes about whether we still save the same amount that we used to. For instance, I don't know, for instance, about emails, whether you just go straight to your inbox and delete them as soon as they're not useful anymore, or whether you keep them. For instance, Grace seemed to have kept quite a few things, so I was able to actually look quite in detail at his private correspondence effectively. So I guess it depends on the person, but it's an interesting kind of change in archiving.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember Zadie Smith wrote an essay a few years ago about keeping a diary, and she says, or she was asked to write about if she ever keeps a diary, and she said she doesn't, and that she's never kept any sort of private writing, and that whatever biographers want to look and see what her life was like are going to have to look at her email inbox, which is like, yeah, again, it's interesting to think about how that's different from correspondence, where you have a lot of control, and it's, just literally correspondence from one person to another, as opposed to all of your Amazon purchases and everything else is sort of loitering around. That, again, like Nick noted, that sort of like the collapse of the boundary between the public and private, or whether, biographers are going to have access to their subjects' metadata or their click streams, or, all sort of these other things that are being recorded that we don't really think about. But yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. It does, as I think someone in the chat says, Nick says he thinks it's a bit dystopian to write as though everything might end up in court. And it is interesting to think about, like, how fundamental could be its own wide-ranging panel, I think, to discuss the implications for personal kind of creativity and thinking for artists and people of all kinds, when there is a sense that, like, all your email, I mean, we're in a world just where, like, email discovery is a thing in so many contexts, and we're just all very aware that kind of anything that you think is private is really not private, at least if it's being transmitted electronically, and that is the way so many of us communicate. So there's like a collapse of just that personal space altogether, of the kind of private working out of your ideas before. Yes, maybe a biographer would get to it in 100 years or whatever, if you were of enough renown to be worthy of all the work of digging up, physical papers. But that's a kind of another thing, but related, the collapse of that space altogether, for the work itself, for what we actually produce as writers, etc. Okay, well, we've just got a few more minutes, so I'm gonna I'd like to end us with this question. That Meghan notes in her talk that Generation X suggests that the world has grown beyond our ability to tell stories about it. And that was 30 years ago. And I'm just kind of curious, your thoughts, each of you, about, do you think it was true then? And is it true now? Has the world grown too large to tell stories about it?
I just want to add, as just a caveat, and I probably should have mentioned this in the talk, is that this observation comes in a novel where where the characters are constantly telling each other stories, right? So I think it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Andrew and Claire and Dag, the whole thing is them telling these sort of like modern parables to each other. But I think that his observation still stands, and I'm really interested in that.
You feel that way viscerally, right? Kind of, a lot of us, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'll let others jump in, but yeah, I think that tension is really interesting.
I guess it could have, because obviously what Meghan is saying is that, not only obviously the characters themselves are storytellers, but also Coupland himself is a storyteller and is obviously, making a living out of it, amongst many other things. So, but I think that what his work is really good at capturing is that, that what Meghan was also talking about, so this sense that those grand narratives have collapsed, and so those are the stories that is, I think, talking about. You could read it, for instance, in a religious sense, but you could also read it in a very secular sense. You could think, for instance, about the idea of progress. So I think he's working in those kind of lines. Those are the narratives that are no longer possible. And that have collapsed. But then again, there are obviously other narratives and other understandings of narratives that are flourishing.
Yeah.
And I think, as Meghan alluded to earlier, there's going to be probably a resurgence or sort of a return to that desire for narrative meaning. And I think that Coupland sort of predicts or prophesies this idea that things will be much more perhaps provincial and regional, and that these meta narratives maybe weren't flexible enough in the first place, and that something kind of new is going to come up and might take from the old, but will be something a little more unique or particular to the individual.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you all. We're here just right at time, so we'll just leave it there. I know there's so much more we could talk about in this area. Thanks again, to Diletta and Meghan and to Nick for the wonderful talks. If you haven't watched them, I highly recommend watching them and watching them multiple times. I feel like I learned something new every time I listened, prepping for this panel. We welcome you to check out imagejournal.org, where we try to host and curate these kind of conversations all the time. And thanks again to the panel organizers for making this event possible, and all of you for being here. And that's it for us.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Nick.
So much, Lisa. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So just to make sure everybody knows that we have a break for 20 minutes. So we will be back. Well, it's 11:20. It'll be 11:20 a.m. here. Diletta, what time is it in the UK? I'm getting confused.
It's 4 now, so it'll be 4:20 when we come back.
So 20 minutes from now, we'll see everybody. Thanks.
I'm enjoying seeing Nick's copy of Generation X.
I'm gonna have to dig it out. It's what a lot of my other college books, but yeah, certainly.
Well done, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.